So while the text was written by Markoosie Patsauq, an Inuk from Inuktitut, a long time ago, and translated into English and then into French, what we have here is a new translation prepared by Valerie Henitiuk and Marc-Antoine Mahieu. So to be more precise, we are not launching only one book today. I would say we are launching 4 books at the same time. First, there's a critical edition titled Uumajursiutik, unaatuinnamut, Hunter with Harpoon, Chasseur, harpon, published by McGill Queen's University Press in 3 languages. There's an English language trade edition titled Hunter with Harpoon, published at Queen's University Press 2. And there are also 2 French language editions. One was published in January by Département in France, and the other one will be very, very soon published, I guess tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, by Boréal in Quebec. So I will not enter into more details concerning the secrets of its fabrication. I let that to the 2 editors. But I would like to start with our distinguished invitee, Mary Simon, who has kindly accepted to participate in this event. Mary Simon is a national Inuit leader and a Canadian diplomat. She was president of Inuit Tapirit Kanatami from 2006 to 2012. She was also president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Canada's first ambassador to the Arctic, and Canada's ambassador to Denmark. And Mary Simon also wrote the preface of the book we are launching today. She had the occasion to meet Markoosie Patsauq, and she will explain in which circumstances and how his life has the potential to inspire younger generations and also older generations in the Canadian Arctic. So Mary will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll have a time to exchange with her for another 10 to 15 minutes. After Mary Simon's presentation and exchanges with her, I will give the floor to Valérie Henitiuk and Marc-Antoine Mahieu for 10 minutes each. Their presentation will follow the reading of 2 short abstracts, 2 short passages in Inuktitut and English, and also a period of questions. So I now turn to Mary Simon, and so Mary arrived a few minutes ago. I know she's here, so Mary, it is your turn now to take the floor.
Okay, Nakomi Carolyn. I'm not sure how many people understand Inuktitut, but I'm going to greet everybody in my language. Nakomi Mayunga, Takani Markoosie Patsauq, Alla si mayang inyo ilaw titaw gama, Tako ilaw natik pang nakata si mayo itamat sa mga Inuktitut nga nilo am ila halo na titong nga nilo, uigo itong nga nilo. Nakomitak amisunod tana at wakta naman. First, I just want to thank Carolyn and Valerie and Marc-Antoine for the invitation to speak with you today. I think it's very important that that this book has been written, not only written by Markoosie, but also translated into other languages so that others can read it and find the inspiration that's contained in this book. And first, I think I'd like to start by just talking about Markoosie a little bit. I'm sorry, there's something wrong with my computer. So I'll continue. So I'm just going to talk about Markoosie for a minute, because I think the launch of this book is very important, and there is always, you know, a strong message behind books like The Hunter with His Harpoon. And I can remember Markoosie. I've met him. I'm sorry, there's my computer keeps going off. I've met Markoosie many times, and I can remember some of the meetings that I attended with him, and particularly the one where he and his family and other Inuit that were relocated to Resolute Bay and Grise Fjord were able to give their testimony to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the High Arctic relocation. That was a very significant event, and it showed the side of Markoosie that maybe a lot of people don't see as much as I did. He was a very good hunter for his family and his community when he was in his community, and but he also had this ability to kind of transcend two worlds. He could go to meetings that were outside of his comfort zone and be able to participate actively in the discussions. And I remember when I was still with Makivik, he came to meetings to talk about the fact that he wanted the relocation issue recognized as something that was forced on his family and his people, and that the federal government should apologize for this injustice. And it finally came to resolution, or not resolution, but they were able to finally tell their story in 1993 at the Royal Commission hearings in Ottawa. And I was the moderator for that meeting, and we spoke Inuktitut during the hearings, and we had translation for those that couldn't speak Inuktitut. And the elders and young people like Markoosie really were able to express the deep meaning and the trauma that they experienced during this relocation, and the great difficulties that they experienced when they were dropped off in Resolute Bay with nowhere to live. They had brought their tents with them and the wood stoves, and they found that there was no wood in Resolute Bay, so they couldn't put their stoves on. And then they also didn't know that it was dark 24 hours during the winter months. And when they were relocated from Inuit, which is a community on the Hudson coast in Nunavik. So I'm just giving you a glimpse of the hardship that was experienced by them. And Markoosie was able to talk to the media. He was able to have discussions with others outside of the hearings. And I could see the side of him that was a very resilient Inuk man that embraced kind of both worlds, the Inuit world and the culture and our identity, and the world outside of our communities, particularly people that didn't speak Inuktitut. And I thought that he was an expression of diversity, and that he brought together two ways of living, and he was able to embrace those two ways of living as an Inuk and as a person that transcended that his culture and his language. So I wanted to talk about that because I think it shows a resilience that young people will find inspiring. Even not just young people, but people in general would find this inspiring. And so when I wrote the preface for the book, I talked a bit about the fact that, you know, the strength and the determination of those that are in his book to survive and grow are kind of the same lessons and strengths that we need in the sort of the never-ending survival struggle in today's world, because our people are still struggling. We're still experiencing a lot of the trauma, the intergenerational trauma that was brought on by residential schools. A lot of our people went to residential schools, and that manifests itself in some of the social problems that we are facing in our communities. So it's really important for us to address those issues. And I thought that I would talk a bit about that as well, because it talks about the resilience of our communities. We all, and the book portrays this, that we are closely linked to the protection of the environment. And that is so important to us, because our wellness and our resilience and our adaptability is reinforced by the fact that we spend a lot of time out on the land. And our young people who are not doing as much as this as we used to when let's say I was growing up, it's very important to talk about that, because it's like we have to regain those land-based life skills. We have to regain and reconnect with our cultural traditions. We have to continue working with traditional or indigenous knowledge. And I think that if we can continue working on those issues, and I know like Carolyn is doing that up in Puvumniduk, talking about the justice system. And here we go again. So I just wanted to talk a bit about that. And recently, everybody probably saw what was happening in Nunavut with the Baffinland mine and the hunters that were out on blocking the runway at the mine. And Inuit don't generally like doing these things, but at some point you kind of reach the end of your rope, because you're trying to reinforce the fact that there has to be a balance between development and the sustainable development and the livelihood of Inuit in the Arctic. And they were trying to reinforce that whole position they had with Baffinland during the hearings, and they didn't seem to be able to get across the message for them enough to have them deal with it. In fact, Baffinland and other organizations were saying that there was no impact, but there is impact. There is no doubt there is impact. And the message there was the fact that if you can't find balance between, let's say, resource development, mining, or there's always talk about oil and gas out of the ocean and the seas, the Arctic Sea, if you can't find a sustainable balance between that activity and the livelihood of Inuit who depend on the marine life for food, then it will eventually destroy the way of life. And I think that message was quite strong when we saw that, the images that came through from the runway at Baffinland, and ultimately the support that they received in the communities with some of the demonstrations that were taking place. So when we talk about governmental services, there is a lot of outstanding unresolved issues. For instance, we continue to have overcrowding in our homes, especially right now during the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been a big concern to have all these people living in overcrowded homes, and how if there was an outbreak in any of the communities like Akvet in Nunavut, that it would spread very quickly, and that has been a big concern. Thankfully, we haven't experienced major outbreaks in Inuit communities, although there have been some major outbreaks in First Nations communities, not in the Arctic, but in the northern part of the provinces. And that has been a very difficult thing, especially with some communities not having any water because spoil advisories were in effect, and sometimes the water trucks couldn't deliver water. It's been a big struggle. So, and then we have education is another issue. Like, we'd like to see a much higher level of culturally based curriculum in our schools, particularly now, like the early childhood education, like the daycares and the care that young people get, young kids or young children get when the parents are at work. And we have Inuit educators that aren't trained to be educators. They're trained to be babysitters in many ways. And we'd like to see that change. We have food security issues. I know that during the pandemic, there has been a real scarcity of lunch programs for communities, not just in Nunavut, but in Nunavut as well, when the lunch programs were cut because the schools were closed. A lot of kids were going hungry because they depended on the lunch program for their part of their meal during the day. So those were things that I was helping with during the last few months. And we also have the, I'm not sure how Carolyn is staying on Zoom, because usually people can't participate in Zoom calls from the communities because the internet connectivity is so bad in most communities. So we've been advocating to whoever will listen that we need to change the connectivity into our communities, because now schools in Southern Canada are depending more and more on online education. And for us, that would be a real benefit in the North, especially with high school students who could take courses that are not necessarily available in the school, in the community. So internet connectivity is big. And energy is also something that we've been concerned about, because most of the Inuit communities have old oil, diesel engine generators, and they're constantly breaking down. So there has to be, I think, more work done to improve into cleaner energy in our communities. After all, you know, we are part of the Canadian system. We are also taxpayers. Inuit are taxpayers, unlike First Nations. So we expect that there should be a general improvement in these services related to our communities. And then there's the issue of climate change, which we have heard over and over again, and how as a region in the Arctic, we're not really contributing to climate change problems, but we are the recipients of climate change problems in our food, in our daily lives, and the impacts of climate change on harvesting and food security is a huge issue. So we've been saying that mitigation is important, but it's being done at a much larger scale in the world community. And we can talk about how it's affecting us, but we don't have a strong, serious impact on the discussions that are going on, except to say how that is affecting us and it needs to change. But the climate change is something that is also affecting our communities. Housing is one of them. I know that, like, as an example, in Inuit, there are homes that are cracking because there's cracks in different parts of their homes because the permafrost is melting. Climate change is making the North and the Arctic much warmer, or it's extreme. Either it's very, very cold in the winter, or it's above freezing. And the changes in temperature throughout the winter has, first of all, an impact. But in the summertime, where it gets much warmer now in the summer, the permafrost is melting. So that in itself has an impact on the houses, which are built on top of soil. And adaptation becomes an important issue. We don't have any funding for adaptation measures, or very little. We have maybe a bit, but not much. So adaptation becomes a big issue. So to end it, I'd like to talk about research, because I know that ArcticNet has been very involved in research. Laval University has been very involved in research. And I think the work that has been done is very, very important. I would encourage the researchers that are with Laval to join with Inuit people that want to do research. And I know that that is being done. But the thing that I find sometimes is that when you work hand in hand or side by side with an Inuk that has Inuit knowledge that is relevant to the research project, and then you have an academic or research, I have an academic doing the research as well, and they both find and use their knowledge base. How do you make that work together without compromising traditional knowledge or even the scientific knowledge? And I think finding that ability to bring about a recommendation for change using both knowledge bases is really important. I've been involved in environmental reviews for the Great Whale River hydro project years ago. I was on the Kativik Environmental Quality Commission, and there was extreme difficulty in trying to bring together those two knowledge bases, because we had hearings in the communities that were most affected by the proposed damming of the Great Whale River Phase 2, and we ended up having to take most of or I didn't do it, the government, and ended up taking out most of the work that had been done relating to the findings from elders and Inuit that spoke to the hearings. So that, those things get compromised, and we have to figure out a way to make sure that that is not compromising the contribution that Inuit knowledge or traditional knowledge can make to research. So I'm going to end it there, and just to go back to Markoosie for a minute, I think, I really appreciate the fact that Valerie and Marc-Antoine have worked hard to get this new publication going and published, because I think it's important to make sure that the work that Markoosie did in writing this book be conveyed in the same fashion as it is written. The messages should be the same, that nothing should be compromised in the translation of this book, or any other book for that matter, that is done in Inuktitut. So I applaud Valerie and Marc-Antoine, and I'm not sure to what degree Carolyn has been involved in this, but she is hosting the event, and I really appreciate it. So I'll leave it at there, Carolyn.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this enlightening presentation. So I'm happy to open to questions now. I look at the time. I would say we can take maybe 10 minutes for questions. So as I said, you can use the chat box or raise your hand, and I'll give you the floor. So may I suggest that the questions are linked to our main subject today, to the book. So, and maybe how Mary Simon, how she knew Markoosie, or so that the discussion will continue to be around the book. If ever I don't see your hand, maybe you should say a word in the chat box, because you are very, there are 53 participants, so I try to verify everything, but I'm not sure I'm able to see everybody at the same time. If there's no question, maybe I should start with one to warm a little bit and to encourage you to ask your questions. But Mary, I would be curious to know how do you think this text has the potential to reach out younger generations? Because sometimes younger people don't feel always or very often interested in reading Inuktitut. So how do you think they could become interested in it, and how the text has the potential to reach them out?
Okay, well, thank you for that question, Carolyn. Yeah, I think it has an opportunity to reach the younger generation. It's true that syllabics is no longer the chosen writing system of the younger generation. Young people are moving more towards the Roman orthography way of writing Inuktitut, and I see that a lot on social media, and in fact I write to a lot of people in that same writing system and syllabics, because in some parts of the Arctic syllabics is not used, and people tend to, if they want to communicate, and because of the dialectal differences, it seems to be easier for the younger generation to either communicate in English or sometimes French, if the two are able to. Some Nunavik youth, younger people, are definitely trilingual. There we have trilingual Inuit right now, which that we didn't have in my era, in my younger years. In fact, French was not taught or provided in our school. So English may be a way of communicating more with the younger generation. If the book is now being published in English, is it? Is it in English? Is the publication in English, the new one?
Yes, in 3 languages.
Oh, in 3 languages. Okay. So yeah.
So English, French, and
okay. So the older generation will read the syllabic version for sure. There may be some younger people that will do that as well, but then the majority will probably either read it in French or English. In Nunavik anyway. In other parts of the Arctic, it would probably be in the Eastern Arctic, syllabics is still used quite extensively. And in the Western Arctic and the Central Arctic, it's Roman orthography, the written form. So there's a mix of writing systems. We're trying to rectify that. We're trying to work towards a common writing system. And there's a lot of work being done, but it's trying to unify that system is difficult because the older people don't want it. They're very, very tied closely to whatever writing system they learned out. They didn't go to school, so they had to learn a writing system, and it's syllabics for a lot of people. So will it, I think if it can reach the younger generation, it will show that Markoosie was an Inuk that was not only a hunter with the harpoon, but he was also a man that could fight for his people. Talk to governments and other people about what they needed as a community, what they fought for during the relocation, and the history of what happened there. It should never be repeated, and that message has always been very clearly given by Markoosie and others that were relocated. And as our organizations in Nunavik and as leaders in the North, we have fully supported their cause, and it has resulted in some resolution. But people still, the thing about Grise Fiord and Resolute is that a lot of the young people that were born up there, even though their parents were from Inuit, a lot of people that were born in Resolute or Grise Fiord are now consider that their home. So it's become permanent. They've become permanent communities. And did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. It was a difficult question. I see that, so Richard Feehan has a question for you too. Maybe we can let him the speech.
Hey, thank you very much, Carolyn. Mary, let me start by thanking you for your words. They're very interesting to hear, and of course, all the work that you do all the time for the community. I'm speaking to you from Edmonton, and so it's a bit of a different circumstance here, but we have a very large, well, comparatively speaking, Inuit community in Edmonton, with obviously quite a difficult history, largely people settling here as a result of the hospitalizations subsequent to TB. But one of the things that I wonder about as an elected official in this community is about the role of government in helping to preserve the Inuit language, and what kind of things we should be doing. It's a little bit different here than it would be in the Arctic, because there's not many opportunities to hear it spoken in the community, but there's still a large number of people here. So I guess I'm just wondering your thoughts on the role from a government perspective to maintain the language.
Okay, so are you a member, or you're a member of the government, the provincial government?
Well, I'm a member of the opposition, Mary.
Oh, the opposition, okay. No, the federal government is, you probably know this, is setting up a new language commission, and there's apparently a substantive amount of funding available for their work, and they're in the process of hiring the head that will be the head of that commission. Now, one of the things that we've been fighting for is funding for language development, because Inuktitut, like any other language, is an evolving language. And with the situation that we are in now, like today's generation in the 21st century, is very different from when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s. So we not only should preserve what we have, we should always have the capacity to help our people in not only engage in the language, but to help keep it alive, like evolving with new terminology. There's everything kind of new that has come up in our culture, like other cultures, indigenous cultures. And that's really, that needs support from governments. The other thing is that families, I meant the education system is not well funded to teach in Inuktitut, to train, make sure we have trained teachers that can teach in other different parts of the country. Like right now, a lot of the teachers Inuit teachers that teach up north have qualifications to teach in the region, but not outside of the region, as an example. And fully qualified teachers, even though they do want to be fully qualified teachers, sometimes they don't go that far because they don't want to leave the north. They don't want to live in a southern city and go to a university, and you know, it's just not doable in many ways. It's something that needs to be addressed, and the governments can help develop. I've been pushing for an Arctic university, an Inuit Nunangat university. And that concept has evolved to a point now where the National Inuit Organization is responsible for that project. And an Inuit Nunangat university would be grounded in Inuit culture and language. And it would also be open to other students. It could be international students or other Canadian students, but the majority of the curriculum developed around that would be based on Inuit culture and knowledge. So if we could ever get that going, I think it would solve some of the problems that we face today in terms of furthering education for our people that are in the north. So there's a lot of different ways, I think, that governments can support families and the education system to not just retain what we have, but to also help revive it, because it is being lost. It's not just in the urban settings that the language is going down. It's up north as well. In Nunavik, we're still one of the strongest regions for Inuktitut. But still, when you see the younger generation now that will become adults in the coming years, their Inuktitut is weaker. So that means it's slowly going down. So unless we can do something about that, it requires funding to do the hard work, the heavy lifting, as I say, and it's reversible. I think the trend of the language going weaker is still very reversible. But if we continue not dealing with it in, like they have in Nunatsiavut in Labrador, there's a handful of people that can speak the language now. And they're finding it extremely difficult to try and revive it, because they're depending on just a few people to try and revive the language. But we still have a good solid base to keep keep it, and our families need to use it. We have to reinforce the fact that every family needs to use it. If they can speak it, they should use it in the family. Like my family, we only spoke Inuktitut when I was growing up, and that's why Inuktitut is my first language. And when you speak it at the home, I mean, I'm sure you are aware of that. When you speak a language at home, that becomes the strongest language in your vocabulary because it's something that you use every single day. And a lot of us, you only learned English when we started school. So it took a long time to get to the level that I am now to be able to speak in English. Sometimes I have problems remembering words, but it's a process and it needs support.
Thank you very much, Mary, for your answer. So I'm happy now to give the speech to Valerie Henitiuk. She's Vice President, Academic and Provost at Concordia University of Edmonton. She previously served as Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation and editor of the Routledge Journal Translation Studies. Valerie has published widely on Japanese literature, as well as women's writing and metaphors of translation. Since 2015, she has been collaborating with Marc-Antoine Mahieu. So now it's your turn, Valerie.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Nakuamik, Mary, for that wonderful perspective on Markoosie, and especially on the theme of resilience. This book project was full of contradictions from the start. Markoosie Patsauq was world famous and yet at the same time largely unknown. He was an influential leader in many fields, but immensely humble. He published both fiction and nonfiction, but also felt that less talk is better. He lived through highly traumatic events, almost dying of TB, being hospitalized in the South as a child, forcibly relocated to the high Arctic residential school, having to fight for justice long denied, and so on, and yet spoke of having had a lucky life. Markoosie wrote for a mixed audience of adults and children, but has typically been classified as a children's author. He wrote for Inuit very specifically, but most of his readers have been non-Inuit. He wrote pared down, powerful prose, but it was edited to appeal to the Southern audience of the day, producing a rather florid style full of cliches. He wrote the first Indigenous novel ever published in Canada, a work of real invention and significance, and yet is rarely included as part of the discourse on this country's literature. The text has a truly fascinating translation history, a journey into a score of other languages involving complex processes of self-translation, retranslation, and relay translation, but has never before been rigorously translated, respecting Markoosie's initial conception. The text, known since 1970 as Harpoon of the Hunter, has been called a sophisticated work of fiction, a classic of Inuit writing in English. It's been likened to masterpieces of Western literature, to Greek tragedy, to Zola, to Jack London and James Fenimore Cooper. There have been essays, reviews, and encyclopedia articles. It's been excerpted in various readers for school children and is found in anthologies of Indigenous Canadian literature. It's been translated from English into languages such as German, Japanese, Hindi, Estonian. But Markoosie did not initially write his text in English. Its first appearance was in Inuktitut, published serially in 1969-70 in Inuktitut magazine. Now, the bilingual author did, at the urging of editor James McNeill, go on to publish a book titled Harpoon of the Hunter, but that version differs in many meaningful respects from Markoosie's original story, which is titled more literally, Hunter with No Means But a Harpoon. And all translations prior to ours were done relay style from that English version rather than directly from the Inuktitut, giving rise to many misconceptions. Markoosie had every reason to be proud of the English adaptation loved by readers worldwide. His book from 50 years ago remains the all-time bestseller for McGill Queen's University Press, for heaven's sake. But it's very, very different from his Inuktitut original. The overall plot line remains the same. A young man named Kamik pursues a polar bear that has killed his father and all other members of a hunting party. Left to fend for himself on the tundra, he's eventually rescued by a search party, although things do end darkly. All those multilingual versions of this text were based on a rewriting of the story, one that was full of embellishments with new phrases, even entire passages added and characters redrawn. The ending had been strikingly revised. So the books being launched today offer readers the first opportunity to read a rigorous translation into any language of Markoosie's Hunter with Harpoon. When, back in 2014, I began looking seriously at the existing English and French versions funded by an Insight Development Grant, I was struck by how Markoosie's text brought to light many of the burning issues in the disciplines of translation studies and comparative literature. In addition to its complex translation history from its initial appearance in manuscript through to the present, this text has been bound up with highly charged political issues, which the author's own life reflects even more acutely. I started private Inuktitut lessons with Minnie Odla Freeman, who taught me a great deal of vocabulary, but even more importantly, was generous with her stories, always so fascinating about all aspects of Inuit culture. Further, Markoosie and I became Facebook friends, and he made me laugh many times, but also moved me with his obvious love of family. Then, in search of a more formal language class to continue my studies, I came upon Marc-Antoine, whose Inuktitut course was recommended by everyone I talked to. Over the next few months, we corresponded about our respective views of Markoosie's text, and agreeing that it really deserved to be translated and properly contextualized, started to collaborate. Not long after, I received a cold call from an editor suggesting that if maybe I had a book proposal, he'd be happy to talk. Well, I said, now that you mention it. And that was Mark Abley from McGill Queen's, the very publisher that had brought out the English adaptation so many years earlier, and thus the ideal choice for what could be a new edition to celebrate the text's 50th anniversary. In these books we've gathered to celebrate today, every effort has been made to ensure the author's unique voice is heard. There are many direct citations from Markoosie himself, from both early writings and more contemporary sources, and the lengthy foreword comprises his own words as captured in the interviews done by Marc-Antoine in 2017, and I know Marc-Antoine will talk in a moment about their collaboration. Recognizing our limitations as non-Indigenous scholars of literature and linguistics, we also draw from contributions of other Inuit writers and thinkers. The intention is to ensure space for voices from the broader community to speak for and about Inuit and their concerns, thereby establishing the context in which this text can most usefully, even ethically, be read. In today's Canada, Markoosie's groundbreaking work, which Thomas King has rightly identified as the beginning of contemporary Indigenous fiction in this country, deserves finally to be made available to be read in English and French versions produced in a manner more respectful of the author as an author and of the story he wanted to tell. It was important to us as well that the full scholarly volume open with Markoosie's initial text in both syllabics and Romanized, to ensure the story is fully accessible to Inuktitut speakers across Canada, with our English and French translations coming only after the Inuit text. With this project, our hope has always been to honor the Inuktitut, to spark dialect that can lead to mutual understanding, to reveal the impressive global impact that Markoosie has had, as well as to encourage more people just to read a great story. Thank you, merci, nakomik.
Thank you, Valérie. So we'll now turn to Marc-Antoine Mahieu. Marc-Antoine teaches Inuktitut linguistics at INALCO, the Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales in Paris. He's also adjunct professor in the Department of Anthropology at Université Laval and consultant for the Catholic School Board in Nunavik. In 2019, he was jointly with Inuit poet Joséphine Bacon awarded the Prix Samuel de Champlain. And Marc-Antoine will talk about the hard work and very interesting work of translation.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Bonjour à tous. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to speak for very long. It's never easy for me to speak in public, especially in these somewhat unreal conditions. I would like to begin by saying that I'm torn between happiness and sadness. It has been a great pleasure to work with Valerie and Markoosie over the past few years, but we are obviously very sad that Markoosie is not with us today to celebrate the launch of our books. I want simply to talk a little bit about collaborating with Markoosie, about his language, and then I will read two brief passages from the text in Inuktitut, which Valerie will then read in our English translation. To begin with, I need to explain why it was necessary to collaborate with Markoosie beyond the obvious ethical reasons. It is often assumed that an indigenous language is much the same as a standardized national language. If you are interested, all you have to do is study it, master it, and then flip open a dictionary when you come across something you don't understand. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way with many indigenous languages, including or especially Inuktitut. As is widely known, Inuktitut has many dialects and variations, but there are very few tools available to study these variations in detail. Further, the structures of Inuktitut, as well as the semantic content it conveys, are very different from those of English or French. So, in order to fully understand an Inuktitut text and translate it rigorously, a great deal of preliminary work is required. You need to establish the text, analyze each word and sentence. Almost nothing can be taken for granted. The ideal way to do this work properly is to meet with the author. This is even more important when the text is written in syllabics without the diacritic signs that indicate vowel length, the final consonant of syllables, and the difference between certain consonants, namely on the one hand r and ng, and on the other hand k and r. This is why, along with the human and ethical reasons I alluded to earlier, it was absolutely critical for us to collaborate with Markoosie. In March 2017, a few days before I arrived in Inuktitut, I called Markoosie to see if he would be willing to talk about Uumajursiutik, unaatuinnamut with me. After a brief moment of silence, he said, yes, and asked me, so when do you arrive? Which day? To my surprise, Markoosie was waiting for me when I got off the plane inside the small, virtually empty airport, and actually took me to the village on his skidoo. For the next 10 days, he was extraordinarily kind. Despite a problem in his eyes that meant he could no longer read, he suggested that we meet as often as possible to talk about his text. He was very happy that Valerie and I, a Uumajursiutik like me, a French guy like me, were interested in what he had actually written in Inuktitut in the late 60s. Our work sessions were held at his home in the Pularvik, the visiting room, right beside his desk. Annie, his wife, was sometimes also present, and his grandchildren were very often there to visit him. I also had the opportunity to work with Markoosie Patsauq, Markoosie's brother, as well as the Inuktitut teachers at Innalik School, to whom Valerie and I extend our deepest thanks. Now I would like to speak briefly about the language used in Markoosie's text. The language of this text is first relatively simple, second somewhat composite, and third stylistically innovative. So why is it relatively simple? Inuktitut words can be and often are enormously long. They function more like full sentences do in English or French. But the average number of productive elements, of productive morphemes per word in Markoosie's text remains low, 4 or less. In addition, these elements are fairly common and limited in number. For instance, Markoosie's text contains fewer than 200 different noun bases, noun stems. Now, why is the language of the text somewhat composite? Markoosie wrote Uumajursiutik, unaatuinnamut in Inuktitut, namely the Inuit language of the Eastern Canadian Arctic. More precisely, it is in the east coast of Hudson Bay dialect, sometimes called Itivimiutitut. But the text also displays marked influences from the North Baffin dialect, resulting from the years Markoosie had been living in the high Arctic at the time he wrote the text. So the language of the manuscript bears the stigma of relocation. To take a few very simple examples, Markoosie uses akka instead of auka in order to say no. He uses tabbauvutit instead of atsune in order to say goodbye. Kissu instead of suna to say what. Ullut and umayut instead of ulluit and umayut to say days and animals. Okay, he uses laukak as a recent past marker, yahanganik in order to say each time to do something, etc. I could give you many examples, but I think I will skip this. Finally, why is Markoosie's text stylistically innovative? Well, the style of Uumajursiutik, unaatuinnamut differs from that of traditional stories, of traditional unikatuat. First, on the level of syntax, sentences are, again, fairly simple. Second, the narrator uses not only zero focalization, which means that the narrator knows more than the characters know, but a system alternating between different points of view about the narrative events. As readers, we enter in turn into the perspective of 4 separate agents. Third, the narration and the story happen at the same time. Markoosie recounts narrative events in the present tense, even though the general rule in unikatuat is subsequent narration. Fourth, the narration contains a substantial amount of direct reported speech and brief dialogues, which are also unusual. So, all in all, Markoosie's text is important, not only from a literary, historical and cultural point of view, but also from a linguistic and pedagogical point of view for the teaching of Inuktitut. To conclude, I would like to share a little anecdote that sums up my memory of Markoosie. Towards the end of our interviews, he asked me, "What is your favorite season here in the north?" I hesitated and then answered, I like all seasons." "I'm glad you answered that," he said. "All seasons are beautiful." I'm now going to read a first excerpt from Uumajursiutik, unaatuinnamut. Tabbani unnuangulaktilugu kappianaqtumuttikitaugut. Kamik siniyong nanginami, ikkumatilugusuli, Kimit mugusiyu alumata, atataminik tupak sivuk sinittumik. Kilamiapik atatangamakipok annuraliq sunilo. Annurarigami silamut anilluni sulikamik annurarasuartilugu. Kamik anigiasilluni silamut takusarami kappianartumik takuvok. Tamani hanittukulummi nanualummik takuvok. Atataminillu takulluni unarminiktikusiliqtumik. Tanna nanualuk himminut payaugami sallumik kamangito. Salluk unarminiktigusilluni nanurmik kapisigialiqtoq. Nanurmik niungagut kapiyok. Tanna nanuk kapiyaugami nillitualuk nipiqqutulluni. Kapiyaugami niummigut nanuk himatsiluni asiyuvok. Unnuangummat, taaktuumat. Tanna kamik kapiasuk kami tabvani aningiturluunit taututuinnatoq. Atsualu huviasungitok kapiasuttualuugami atataminilluunit ikayunginami. Isumaliqsunilu immaha suli uumajorsiunirmik hauyimangitok.
That night, something terrible happens. Kamik has not been able to sleep and is still lying awake when the dogs start howling furiously. He wakes his father, who in no time is up and pulling on his clothes. He is already outside before Kamik is fully dressed. When Kamik finally sticks his head out, a frightening scene unfolds before his eyes. A huge bear right in front of him and his father reaching for his harpoon. Under attack from the dogs, the bear pays no attention to Saluk, who raises his weapon and thrusts it into one of the animal's legs. The bear lets out an awful roar. Wounded, it runs away, disappearing into the dark night. Kamik, paralyzed with fear, has only looked on, not even stepping out of the igloo. He's very unhappy that his fear kept him from helping his father and wonders whether he really knows anything yet about hunting.
Thank you very much, Valérie and Marc-Antoine. This is so beautiful at the same time and a difficult story, the story of a human being alone. What I can hear from the passage, but not necessarily alone, because he's with the environment. So I think it's. I will let the occasion for the questions, and there are also people writing in the chat box. Congratulations, félicitations. I see a first question from Don Valentine. Valerie, what was it like to meet Markoosie himself and to be able to hear from him about his life? Where was it that you met him?
Thank you for the question, Dawn, and thank you, Carolyn. I didn't work as closely with Markoosie as Marc-Antoine did, but I did have the opportunity to meet him one time. It was in Montreal when he was in the city for medical treatment. And I spent an evening with him, sort of walking him through the manuscript and showing him the kind of evidence that we had acquired, that we'd compiled about how influential his writing had been around the world. And he was very pleased to hear that. At the time, I think Marc-Antoine has already mentioned his eyes were very bad and he couldn't read himself, but I did read a few bits out loud to him. And he was wonderful. He talked a lot with me about his lucky life, despite the trauma, despite the challenges. And I was very moved by his resilience. We also talked about some of his favorite movies. He loved The Planet of the Apes, for example. And his favorite hockey team was the Edmonton Oilers. So we talked about that, which was great fun as well. He was a charming man, very intelligent, very thoughtful, very kind. And I'm just very grateful I had the chance to meet him, and only very sad that he isn't with us today.
Okay, perfect. There's another question. I think Simi Chung would like to ask a question, so I encourage you to open your mic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Valerie and Marc-Antoine. It's still so fascinating, the journey that you've shared, and I can truly see how it was a labor of love. You've shared some of the challenges, I think, in the translation, and that really speaks to me, speaking another language, when I see translations and how sometimes things get lost in translation. So I think it's incredible what you have done alongside Markoosie. A question for you, for both of you. What was the biggest surprise that you came across in either the journey or the actual translation itself?
Yeah, there were a number of surprises, but the challenges were so many. One of the challenges with producing the English translation, for example, was there's a lot of repetition in the Inuktitut, and we were always a little afraid of, overburdening an English reader with a style of narration which was quite different from what an English reader might be expecting, right? And yet we wanted to very much be very respectful of Markoosie's text and what he was writing, and allow readers access to an Inuit way of writing. So that was a big challenge for us, and only readers can tell us if we succeeded.
There's a question from Irene Siwenki. She's asking to Valérie and Marc-Antoine, what are the benefits and challenges of working on a collaborative translation?
Again, I let you answer, Valerie. I let you answer that question. I'm not.
I'll start and you can answer. But yeah, I think there were many, many benefits to working collaboratively. First of all, I'm still in a very early stages of my studies of the language, so I'm very, very far from reading anywhere near fluently. And so the fact that Marc-Antoine brought the knowledge of the language to our collaboration was amazing. And then we had very complementary skills. I brought perhaps a different background in literature and comparative literature, literary history, translation studies as a discipline, which is quite different from the background that Marc-Antoine brought to the book or to the project. The other challenge that we faced, of course, I'm based in Edmonton and Marc-Antoine is based in Paris. And so this book was really produced, these books were produced via email, emailing pretty much every day, multiple times a day. And that was a challenge, but it was also a chance to really work intimately in a way that was very particular. Maybe Marc-Antoine wants to say more. I'm not sure. There's so many things I could say about this too.
I have a question. I think you didn't tell us how long it took from, the idea of the book, the first meeting with Markoosie up to now. So I'm curious about that.
All in all, I think it took 3 years, maybe, Valerie, something like that, 3 years, but I started to analyze the text long before Valerie and I met, but I think it took maybe 3 or 4 years. What would you say, Valerie?
Yeah, it was multiple years, and it would have been even longer if Marc-Antoine hadn't already done all of the work to establish the text, analyze the morphemes and everything. And so I think Marc-Antoine's relationship to this text is much longer than my own, but it still took a lot of time for sure for both of us. Inuktitut is not an easy language. The text is it's deceptively simple because it's actually a very complex project to work on. And then, of course, to produce the critical framing, doing all of the research into the reviews, the other the translations, the history of that English adaptation and how complex that is. That took a tremendous amount of time and back and forth as well. But it was a true pleasure, and I will say that I absolutely loved working with Marc-Antoine on this project. We're kind of a dream team in some ways.
It's true.
If Valérie and Marc-Antoine, do you have anything to add before I close this book launch?
I'll just say Yeah, thank you, Carolyn, for hosting us. Thank you especially to Mary Simon for that wonderful talk about some of the life and career of Markoosie, but also of some of the contemporary issues facing Inuit communities today and how we can possibly work together as co-citizens of this country and the planet Earth. And thank you to everybody for coming. I was so pleased to see
you, everybody.
colleagues here.
Yeah.
And I'm happy
Thank
to answer other questions if people wanted to email us. I think we'd be happy to engage by email as well. I don't think we got to all of them.
And a big thank you also to Mary. Thank you so much.
I'm impressed with your Inuktitut.
No.
Yeah, it's very good. It's very good.
There are a lot of people who are saying congratulations to all the speakers. So I just want to share that with you. If you go in the chat box, you'll see all those kind messages. So there were today almost 50 participants. It's a lot of people coming from different countries. So maybe we can say that Markoosie's text has the potential to gather people from different horizons. I have the French word coming from different horizons. So thank you to Valérie, Marc-Antoine, and Mary for having inviting us in the text of in Markoosie's text, in having bring us traveling with Markoosie in his story, in his language, in his story, and I hope this text will continue to travel across the languages, across the countries, and the generations too. So I think that journey has started a long time ago, and it will continue now thanks to your work. So thank you very much to you. Thank you to all the participants for having been with us today, and a long life to Markoosie's story.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. Nakomi.
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 Merci à tous. Au revoir.
Au revoir.